That night, the sky over the remote village of Jelapronowang was pitch black, barely illuminated by the faint light of the moon peeking through thick clouds. Jaka, a young man known for his bravery and skepticism towards superstitions, sat with his 3 friends, Andi, Budi, and Rina, at a small tavern owned by Pakdarto. They laughed and joked, dispelling the creeping silence of the night. "Have you ever heard the story of the flying coffin?" asked Pakdarto, an old man with white hair sitting in the corner of the tavern. His voice was raspy, filled with a seriousness that suddenly muted the group's laughter. "Ah, an old tale, Pakdarto," Jaka responded dismissively with a smirk. "Just nonsense to scare the children." Pakdarto leaned closer, his gaze serious. "You might think it's just a joke, boy, but many have seen it, and none of them ever returned safely." Andi, who was sitting next to Jaka, shuddered at those words, but tried to stay composed. "Has anyone really seen it?" "Indeed," Pakdarto replied in a low tone. "Those who have seen the coffin, they usually never come back." Hearing this, Jaka felt challenged. He had heard many horror stories from the villagers before, but never had he found anything that could be proven. He stood up, looking at his friends with eyes blazing with excitement. "I'll prove it's all just a myth. Let's go to the forest tonight and find this so-called terrifying flying coffin." Andi and Budi exchanged hesitant glances, while Rina, although clearly scared, didn't want to appear cowardly in front of her friends. After a moment, they all agreed. With youthful courage that knew no fear, they decided to venture into the forest at midnight. Midnight arrived. Jaka and his friends gathered at the edge of the village, right in front of the path leading into the forest. The atmosphere was tense, with only the sounds of crickets and the occasional gentle breeze. A thick fog began to settle, enveloping the forest ahead of them, making the scene even more eerie. They slowly walked into the forest, under the cover of tall trees that seemed like giant shadows in the darkness. Jaka led the way, his flashlight illuminating the path strewn with dry leaves. Budi, who walked at the back, had felt something strange since they entered the forest, but he chose to remain silent. Each step grew heavier, not due to the terrain, but because of the tension hanging in the air. It was as if the forest itself was waiting for something, holding its breath in the darkness. After a few minutes of walking, the usual night sounds like the rustling of leaves and the whispering wind suddenly ceased, replaced by an unsettling silence. Andi, the most anxious among them, suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Something's watching us," he whispered, his voice trembling. Jaka turned around, seeing his friends who were growing more uneasy. "Relax, it's just your imagination," Jaka said, trying to divert their attention from the fear that was starting to creep in. But soon after, they all heard a strange creaking sound from a distance, like wood grinding against wood. The sound was so unfamiliar, and it drew closer slowly, making their hearts pound faster. "Maybe it's just a branch falling," Jaka suggested, trying to calm them down, although doubt was beginning to surface in his own heart. Suddenly, Rina stopped, her eyes widening as she stared at something in the distance. What is that?" Her voice was barely audible. All eyes turned to the direction Rina was pointing. Through the thickening fog, a large shadow emerged, hovering low and moving slowly between the trees. Its shape was rectangular, and they immediately recognized it: a coffin, floating with no one in sight to carry it. The atmosphere grew tense. The coffin moved closer to them, accompanied by the eerie creaking sound, as if wood was being scraped together. They all froze in place, unable to move, their eyes wide open as they watched this unexpected sight. The thick fog wrapped around Jai and his friends, obscuring their surroundings and tightening the grip of fear that had taken hold of them. The floating coffin continued its slow, deliberate approach, its creaking sound reverberating in the stillness of the night. Rina clutched Andi's arm, her face pale with terror, while Budi took a step back, his breath quickening. Jaka, though trembling, forced himself to remain calm. This can't be real," he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize the impossible sight before him. But as the coffin drew nearer, it became harder to deny the dread that was steadily overtaking his disbelief. Suddenly, the coffin stopped, hovering eerily just a few feet away from them. For a moment, everything was silent. So silent that Jaka could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, with a loud creak, the lid of the coffin began to open slowly, revealing only darkness within. Andy's legs gave way, and he collapsed to the ground, staring in horror at the opening coffin. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice shaking. But before anyone could move, a dark, amorphous shadow began to rise from within the coffin, taking on a vaguely human shape. It had no face, only a pair of glowing red eyes that pierced through the fog and the darkness. The shadow's presence exuded a coldness that seemed to seep into their bones, paralyzing them with fear. Jaka, who had been the most skeptical of all, now found himself at a loss for words. The shadow turned its gaze toward them, and in an instant, the temperature around them dropped sharply. The fog thickened further, swirling around the shadow as if it were drawing power from the very air. The shadow raised what looked like a hand, and the wind began to howl through the trees, causing the branches to sway violently. The creaking of the coffin grew louder, almost deafening, as if the entire forest was groaning under the weight of the evil presence. Booty tried to scream, but no sound came out, his voice stolen by the overwhelming terror. Just then, Rena began to faint, her body collapsing onto the damp forest floor. Jaka and Andy rushed to her side, their panic now at its peak. The shadow advanced, its form seeming to stretch and grow taller as it loomed over them. It spoke in a voice that echoed through the night, low and guttural, uttering words they couldn't understand, but that filled them with dread. "We have to move, now!" Jaka yelled, snapping out of his paralysis. He grabbed Rena, hoisting her up with Andy's help, and the three of them began to stagger backward, away from the advancing shadow. But the fog had grown so thick that they could barely see the path they had come from. The forest, which had seemed so familiar in the daylight, now felt like a maze, every turn leading them deeper into darkness. As they stumbled through the fog, the shadow seemed to follow them, always just behind, its red eyes burning through the mist. The wind howled louder, as if the forest itself was alive, and they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet, as if trying to pull them back toward the coffin. Suddenly, Booty, who had been trailing behind, let out a strangled cry. He had tripped over a root and fallen, unable to get back up in his panic. Jaka and Andy turned back to help him, but as they reached out, the shadow surged forward with terrifying speed, engulfing Booty in its dark form. "Booty!" Jaka shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. The shadow wrapped itself around Booty, and in a heartbeat, he was gone, vanished into the darkness with only the echo of his scream lingering in the air. Jaka and Andy were frozen in shock, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. But they couldn't afford to stay there. They had to escape. With Rena barely conscious, they forced themselves to move, pushing forward through the dense fog, driven by pure instinct and fear. The shadow, now larger and more menacing, continued to pursue them, relentless in its hunt. Jaka could feel its icy presence creeping closer, threatening to consume them as it had Booty. He knew they couldn't outrun it forever. Jaka, Andy, and Rena staggered through the fog, their breath ragged, their legs heavy with exhaustion. The forest seemed endless, the trees blending into one another as they tried to find a way out. But the shadow was always behind them, its presence a constant reminder of the horror they were fleeing from. Rena, barely conscious, clung to Jaka's arm as they moved forward. Her strength was fading fast, and Jaka knew they were running out of time. Andy, though terrified, tried to keep his focus, scanning the surroundings for any sign of an escape route. Suddenly, through the thick fog, Jaka spotted a faint light flickering in the distance. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was the first glimmer of hope they'd seen since the nightmare began. "There!" he shouted, pointing toward the light. "We have to go there!" With renewed determination, they pushed through the fog, heading toward the light. As they drew closer, they realized it was coming from a small, old wooden chapel, half hidden among the trees. The chapel's door was slightly ajar, and a warm, inviting glow spilled out, cutting through the darkness. They stumbled to the entrance, their hearts pounding with both hope and fear. The shadow was still behind them, closer than ever, its red eyes glowing brighter as it pursued them. Without hesitation, Jaka pushed the door open and they rushed inside, slamming it shut behind them. The moment they entered, the atmosphere changed. The oppressive cold of the shadow's presence seemed to diminish, replaced by a calming warmth that filled the chapel. The interior was simple, with wooden pews and a small altar at the front. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering softly, casting long shadows across the room. Jaka gently laid Rina down on one of the pews. Andi collapsed beside her, panting heavily, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. The warmth of the chapel seemed to revive Rina slightly, and she opened her eyes, looking around in confusion. Where? Where are we? We found a chapel, Jaka explained, trying to sound calm. I think we're safe here. But just as he said those words, the door they had just closed began to creak. The wood groaned under pressure as the shadow forced its way through the darkness. The warmth of the candles flickered as the shadow's cold presence filled the room, making it clear that they were far from safe. Jaka knew they couldn't escape this thing by running any longer. They had to confront it, here and now. He looked around desperately for anything they could use to defend themselves, but the chapel was bare, offering no weapons or tools. Then, his eyes fell on a dusty, leather-bound book lying on the altar. Instinctively, he grabbed it, hoping it might contain something, anything that could help them. The book was ancient, its pages yellowed with age, but Jaka could see symbols and text written in a language he didn't understand. As the shadow fully entered the chapel, its form more solid and menacing than before, Jaka frantically flipped through the pages. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he had to try something. The shadow began to stretch towards them, its red eyes burning with malevolence. The candle's flames flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that danced around the room. Just as it was about to engulf them, Jaka's eyes landed on a passage that seemed to glow faintly. Without thinking, he began to recite the words aloud, his voice trembling. At first, nothing happened. But then, as he continued reading, the shadow hesitated, its form wavering. The red eyes dimmed slightly, and the coldness in the room began to lift. Encouraged, Jaka raised his voice, reciting the words with more confidence. The shadow recoiled, retreating slightly toward the door, as if the words were pushing it back. But it wasn't enough. The shadow seemed to rally, its form solidifying again, and it surged forward with renewed fury, determined to consume them. Andi, realizing the shadow was resisting, joined in, repeating the words Jaka was chanting. Their voices echoed together in the small chapel, growing louder and more powerful with each passing second. Rina, still weak but determined, also began to speak the words, adding her voice to theirs. The combined force of their voices seemed to weaken the shadow further. The red eyes dimmed almost completely, and the darkness that surrounded it began to dissolve, retreating back into the coffin from which it had emerged. With a final, desperate push, Jaka, Andi, and Rina shouted the last words of the chant. The shadow let out a piercing, inhuman scream as it was forced back into the coffin, its form disintegrating into wisps of dark smoke. The coffin lid slammed shut with a thunderous bang, sealing the entity inside. The candles in the chapel flared brightly for a moment before returning to their normal glow. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by the gentle warmth of the candlelight. The fog outside began to lift, revealing the clear night sky. Jaka, Andi, and Rina collapsed onto the floor, completely drained but alive. The nightmare was over. They had faced the horror of the flying coffin and survived. As dawn began to break, they made their way out of the chapel, the morning light bathing the forest in a soft golden hue. The village was just visible in the distance, a safe haven after the terror they had endured. They walked in silence, the weight of the night's events still heavy on their minds. But as they approached the village, there was a sense of relief, a feeling that they had been given a second chance. The chapel, now hidden once more by the trees, stood as a silent guardian over the forest, a reminder of the darkness that lurked within and the courage it took to overcome it. The story ends with Jaka, Andi, and Rina finally stepping into the sunlight, their ordeal behind them, but the memory of that night forever etched in their minds, a reminder that some legends are more than just stories.